Poor single mom paid for a coffee for a strange man. The next morning, a helicopter landed at her house. It was a quiet, gray morning in early fall when rain tapped gently against the large windows of Cornerstone Café, a small, cozy shop tucked away on a sleepy street in a modest Iowa town. The scent of fresh coffee and cinnamon filled the air, mingling with the soft hum of conversation and the hiss of the espresso machine. Grace Whitmore, 26, moved behind the counter with practiced ease, though her eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. Her blonde hair was pulled into a messy ponytail, strands falling loosely around her pale face. She wore a faded flannel shirt under a worn denim jacket, and her jeans were frayed at the cuffs. Despite everything, she smiled at each customer, her voice soft and kind. The cafe was beginning to wake up with the town. She wiped down the counter and refilled the sugar jars, her thoughts drifting to whether she could pick up an extra shift at the hotel that evening. The morning rush hadn't started yet, and for a brief moment, there was quiet. Then the door opened, and a gust of wind and rain followed the man who stepped inside. He looked about 30, tall, lean, with dark hair slicked back from the drizzle. His clothes were plain, a gray sweatshirt, faded jeans, and a lightweight jacket now soaked through at the shoulders. A canvas backpack was slung over one shoulder, slightly damp. His boots left faint wet prints on the floor. Grace glanced up instinctively, offering her usual polite smile. The man approached the counter and reached into his jacket pocket, then froze. "Damn," he muttered under his breath, checking another pocket, then another. He looked up, slightly embarrassed. "I think I left my wallet in the car, and my phone just died." Grace hesitated. The cafe owner, Mr. Dixon, overheard the exchange and stepped over quickly. "If you don't have money, I can't serve you. We're not a charity," he said bluntly, arms crossed. The man nodded awkwardly, clearly ready to walk away. "Understood. Sorry." Grace looked at him for a moment, wet, cold, and maybe just a little lost. There was something in his eyes that caught her attention, a flicker of vulnerability quickly hidden behind polite resignation. Without a word, she turned her back to both men, keyed in a transaction at the register, and pulled a cup from the stack. "Black coffee, right?" she said, her voice light. The man blinked. Yeah." She poured the cup, placed a lid on it, and slid it toward him. "On the house," she added quietly. Then, under her breath, "Just let me do this." Mr. Dixon frowned but said nothing. The man hesitated, then stepped forward slowly. He took the coffee, his fingers brushing hers briefly. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. Grace gave a small, tired smile. "Kindness is all I can afford right now." There was silence for a beat. He looked at her, really looked, and in that moment his expression shifted. There was no flirtation, no charm, just quiet awe, like he had stumbled upon something unexpectedly rare. Her face framed by messy strands of golden hair, her hands chapped and red from dishwater, her eyes soft but tired, like someone who had spent too long holding up the world for someone else. That look in his eyes lingered a moment longer than it should have. "Thank you," he said finally, voice low. "Truly." She gave a small nod, already turning back to the espresso machine as the next customer approached. He stood there a second longer, watching her like someone who had just glimpsed something real in a world full of noise. Then he left, taking his coffee and his damp footprints with him. But Grace didn't see the way he paused just outside the window, turning once to look back at the girl who had offered kindness when she had nothing else to give. The sky had darkened by the time. Grace stepped off the bus and walked the last few blocks to the daycare nestled between a laundromat and a boarded-up store. The pavement was still damp from the morning rain. Her thin jacket did little to block the chill, and her feet throbbed after a day on them. The bell above the door jingled softly as she entered. Miss Carla, the elderly woman who ran the place, offered a tired but kind smile. "She's been a little more tired than usual," she said, nodding toward the corner. Grace followed her gaze. Nancy, her 3-year-old daughter, lay curled up on a beanbag chair, small and pale, wrapped in a pink fleece blanket. Her chest rose and fell with a raspy rhythm, each breath marked by a dry, persistent cough. Grace knelt beside her, brushing a damp curl from Nancy's forehead. The child stirred and opened her eyes slowly. "Mommy?" she whispered hoarsely. "Hey, sweet pea. Ready to go home?" Grace smiled, trying to hide the worry in her voice. Nancy nodded and reached up. Grace thanked Miss Carla and stepped back into the night. The short walk home felt endless. Nancy's warm, fragile weight pressed against her, each cough loud in the stillness. Their apartment was on the second floor of a weathered duplex. Inside, it was clean but sparse. A small couch, a second-hand crib, a folding table scattered with crayons and snack wrappers. Grace laid Nancy on the couch and turned on the humidifier. She heated a can of chicken noodle soup and fed it to her daughter in small spoonfuls. Later, after a bath and 2 lullabies, Nancy drifted off in her crib. Grace sat on the floor beside her, one hand resting gently on her daughter's back, counting each breath. Her mind, as always, wandered to the folder in the kitchen drawer. 6 months ago, Nancy had been diagnosed with a congenital heart defect. The clinic sent them to a specialist who confirmed the need for surgery. Soon, not urgent yet, but soon. The kind of soon that haunted Grace's sleep. She had taken Nancy to 3 hospitals, applied for aid, filled out forms, made calls, but no insurance meant no guarantee and no help. She earned just enough to stay above the poverty line and too little to afford the surgery. To survive, she worked 2 jobs. After early mornings at the café, she cleaned motel rooms late into the night. Some days, she was so exhausted she fell asleep on the floor next to Nancy's crib. She had no family close by. Her mother had passed. Her father was long gone. Nancy's father had walked out the day Grace showed him the ultrasound. "I can't do this," he'd said, grabbing his coat. So Grace did it alone. She sold old jewelry, clipped coupons, canceled anything non-essential. She smiled for Nancy, who never complained, who always asked, "Are we okay, Mommy?" with eyes far too wise for her age. Grace had become good at surviving, but surviving wasn't the same as living. That night, once Nancy slept, Grace sat alone at the kitchen table, the fridge casting a soft glow into the dim room. She pulled out the folder, running her fingers along the worn papers she could no longer afford to ignore. She didn't cry. She rarely did now. Instead, she pressed a hand to her chest as if holding herself together. Tomorrow, she would return to the café, pour coffee for strangers, and act like her world wasn't quietly unraveling. But tonight, she sat in the silence, listening to her daughter's breathing down the hall and praying it would still be there in the morning. The next morning, just as the café's first customers were beginning to trickle in, Grace was wiping down the counter when the door opened with a soft chime. She looked up and paused. It was him, the man from the day before, but now he looked different. His clothes were dry, neatly pressed. A navy coat replaced the damp gray jacket, and his dark hair was combed back. He looked refreshed, even amused, like someone who had planned this visit. He approached the counter with a tentative smile. "Hi, do you remember me?" Grace raised an eyebrow. "Of course. Not many people forget their wallet and their luck on the same day." He laughed. "Guilty as charged. I figured I owed you a proper thank you." "You don't owe me anything," she said, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Well, maybe just a cup of coffee," he replied. "One I actually pay for this time." She nodded and began preparing his drink. "Black coffee, right? You remembered." When she handed him the cup, he dropped a 20 into the tip jar without comment. She noticed but didn't say anything. They exchanged a few words. He asked about her work schedule. She gave a vague smile. Most people didn't really want to hear the truth. He didn't push, but he came back. Every morning, same time, same table near the counter. He never brought a laptop or acted busy. Sometimes he read a paperback. Sometimes he just sipped his coffee and watched the world go by. Grace tried not to overthink it. Maybe he was passing through town, trying to clear his head. He always ordered the same drink, tipped generously, and smiled when she brought it over. Her coworker Maya was more curious. "He's not just here for the coffee," she whispered one morning, nudging Grace. "Maybe he likes the peace and quiet." Maya smirked. "Or maybe he likes you." Grace rolled her eyes but felt warmth creeping into her cheeks. One day, Grace noticed Mason. She had finally caught his name on his card, chatting casually with Maya near the counter. He was relaxed, easy to talk to, and he listened. Not the polite kind of listening, but real listening. The kind where he remembered details and followed up days later. She hadn't met many men like that. A few days later, on a chilly afternoon, Grace stood with Nancy outside the preschool. The temperature had dropped, and wind pushed against her thin coat. Nancy, bundled in an oversized sweater, was curled tightly in her arms, coughing softly. The bus was late. Grace rubbed her back gently. "Almost home, sweetheart," she murmured. Headlights turned the corner. A black SUV slowed to a stop beside them. The window rolled down. "Mason, need a ride?" he asked. Grace hesitated. She hated accepting help, but Nancy was shaking, her little nose red and runny. "Yes," she said quietly. They slid into the back seat. Nancy lay across her mother's lap, her eyes fluttering closed almost immediately. Mason adjusted the heat and turned on soft music. He drove gently, careful not to disturb the sleeping child behind him. The car was warm. Grace leaned her head against the window. She had not slept more than 4 hours a night in weeks. Nancy's breathing had steadied, and the hum of the engine blurred her edges. Slowly, she drifted off. The ride was quiet. Mason glanced back through the mirror. Grace's head had fallen slightly to the side, her hair tousled. Nancy was curled against her chest, both perfectly still. When he pulled up to their building, he turned off the engine and sat for a moment, just looking at them. The music played softly, a cello weaving through the silence. He turned in his seat, studying Grace's face, so peaceful, so tired. Without thinking, he reached forward and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Her eyes opened. Caught. Mason froze. His hand hovered midair. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, voice quiet. "You just look tired. I didn't want to wake you." Grace blinked, then gave him a small, tired smile, real in a way none of the others had been. That smile stayed with him long after. He got out and opened the door for her. Nancy didn't stir as he lifted her gently. Grace followed silent. Mason carried the little girl up the steps like she weighed nothing. At the door, he handed Nancy back and placed her backpack at Grace's feet. "Take care of her," he said softly. "And of yourself, too." Grace nodded, her throat tight. He turned and walked away without looking back. She stood in the doorway, watching the SUV disappear into the fading light, her daughter asleep in her arms, and her heart just a little less guarded than it had been that morning. It was a slow Thursday afternoon at the café when Mason noticed Grace moving more slowly than usual. She smiled when spoken to, but it never quite reached her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly as she refilled the creamers, and her shoulders sagged with weight she no longer bothered to hide. He didn't say anything. Not yet. Later that day, as he got into his SUV, something caught his eye. A small folder wedged between the passenger seat and the door. It must have slipped from Grace's bag the night he had driven her and Nancy home. He picked it up, intending to return it, but something made him pause. His fingers lingered on the edge of the folder, and after a moment, he opened it. Inside were medical documents, scans, charts, and notes. At the top of each page, Nancy Whitmore. He sat motionless in the driver's seat for several minutes, flipping through the papers. The words were cold and clinical. Congenital heart defect, high surgical risk, procedure recommended within 14 days, pediatric cardiology consult. But beneath the jargon, the truth hit hard. Nancy was very sick, and she was running out of time. That night, Mason couldn't sleep. He lay awake in his condo, the glow of city lights spilling across the ceiling. He thought about Nancy's tiny hand wrapped around a spoon at the café, her head nestled on Grace's shoulder, the sound of her cough in the back seat, and Grace, strong, worn, quietly holding everything together, smiling even when it was clear she was unraveling inside. The next morning, Mason returned to the cafe earlier than usual, the folder in hand. When Grace saw it, her face went pale. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, wiping her hands on her apron. "I didn't mean to leave that there." "It's okay," Mason said gently. "I read it." She froze. "I wasn't trying to snoop," he added, "but I'm glad I did." Grace looked away, her cheeks flushed. "It's not something I talk about." "I get it," Mason said, "but maybe you should." They sat in the corner booth, the one Mason always chose. Grace stared down at the table as she spoke. "She was born with a heart defect," she said softly. "It didn't show at first, but as she got older, she got tired easily, got sick a lot. Eventually, the doctor said surgery wasn't optional. It was necessary." Mason listened quietly. "We've seen 4 hospitals. I sent her records to Mayo Clinic last week. They've got one of the best pediatric teams in the country, but they won't schedule her without proof of payment or insurance." She looked up, eyes hollow from too many nights without sleep. "I don't have either." Mason didn't respond right away. Then he leaned forward. "How long do you have?" 2 weeks, she whispered. "Maybe less." He nodded slowly, each word sinking deep. A customer entered, and Grace had to get back to work. Mason stood quietly, slipping the folder back into her bag before he left. That night, he sat in his car outside the cafe. He gripped the steering wheel, staring straight ahead while the world moved around him. Cars passed. People came and went, but inside that car, it was silent. Then he looked down at his hands and slowly curled one into a fist. There was no drama, no speech, just a decision. Quiet, firm. Something shifted in him that night, not just for Grace and Nancy, but for Mason himself. Because for the first time in a long while, he was ready to step into someone else's battle. And this time, he had no intention of letting them lose. It started with a cough, deep, strained, different. Grace bolted upright from the floor where she had dozed off beside Nancy's bed. The tiny girl lay curled on her side, her face flushed, her breathing ragged. "Nancy," Grace whispered, touching her daughter's cheek. It burned with fever. Then came the second cough, then a third. And suddenly Nancy was gasping for air, clutching her chest. "Oh God, no, no, no," Grace said, her voice shaking. She scooped Nancy into her arms and ran for the phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. Her heart pounded as she gave their address, begged for an ambulance, tried to keep Nancy calm as her daughter whimpered against her. By the time the paramedics arrived, Nancy was barely responsive. Grace rode in the back of the ambulance holding her daughter's tiny hand, whispering, "Mommy's here, baby. Just breathe. Stay with me." But when they reached the local hospital, Grace's heart sank. The ER was small, under-equipped. The attending physician shook his head after reading Nancy's chart. "She needs to be at a pediatric cardiac center. We're stabilizing her, but she can't stay here." "But where? How? She needs help now," Grace cried. The doctor was already making calls, trying to find a facility with availability, but time was slipping. Grace stood in the hallway, her arms wrapped around herself, panic clawing at her chest. Her daughter was dying, and there was nothing she could do. Then her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but she answered it anyway, breathless. "Grace." It was Mason's voice. Steady, urgent. "Mason," her voice cracked. She's not okay. They said she needs to be transferred, but they don't have..." "I know," he said gently but firmly. "I'm sending help. Just hold on." "What? What do you mean?" 20 minutes. Stay where you are. I've got everything covered." Then he hung up. Grace stood frozen, phone still to her ear. 20 minutes. The hospital staff had barely finished preparing Nancy for transfer when the rumble of rotor blades cut through the night. Nurses and doctors turned toward the window, stunned. Outside, A sleek white helicopter bearing the logo of a private medical transport company was descending onto the high school's football field next to the hospital. Lights flooded the area. The blades whirred like thunder. A man in a black coat stepped down from the aircraft as the medical team opened the emergency doors. It was Mason. His eyes scanned the chaos until they found Grace, who stood by a gurney with Nancy bundled in blankets, oxygen mask over her face. He moved without hesitation. "Is she stable enough to fly?" he asked the attending nurse. "We think so, but the window's closing." Mason looked at Grace. "Come with us." She stared at him wide-eyed as he gently lifted Nancy into his arms, cradling her as if she were his own. They ran together through the cold night air, the wind from the blades whipping around them. Once inside, the doors shut and the helicopter lifted into the sky. Grace sat beside Mason, holding Nancy's hand, watching the machines beep in rhythm with her daughter's faint heartbeat. The hum of the aircraft filled the cabin. She could barely breathe. Then she turned to him. "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracked. "Why are you doing this?" Mason looked at her, his eyes darker than usual, not with anger, but with something older, deeper. "Because no one helped my mom when she needed it," he said softly. "I won't let history repeat." Grace didn't say anything. Her lips trembled, her throat closed. She reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his, and finally the tears came. She cried, not just from fear, but from the overwhelming relief of not being alone anymore, of someone showing up, and of someone choosing to stay. The helicopter flew through the night toward Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, where Dr. Keller and his team waited, and Grace sat in the soft glow of the cabin, her daughter beside her, and a man across from her who had arrived like something out of a dream, except he was real and he was not leaving. The helicopter touched down on the roof of Mayo Clinic just after midnight. A specialized pediatric team rushed to receive Nancy, who was whisked into the cardiac wing under a flurry of coordinated motion. Grace stumbled behind them, clutching Mason's coat sleeve like an anchor. The next hours passed in a blur of forms, tests, and briefings. Mason never left her side. He spoke calmly to the doctors, answered questions when Grace's mind went blank, and signed paperwork without hesitation. By dawn, Nancy was stabilized and resting in a pediatric ICU room. Her surgery was scheduled for 48 hours later, just enough time to prepare her body for the ordeal ahead. Grace stood at the window, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the skyline. Exhaustion weighed her down, but sleep felt impossible. "Come on," Mason said softly behind her. "I got us a place nearby, just a few blocks away. You need rest." "I'm not leaving her," Grace whispered. "I didn't say we'd go far." He offered a faint smile. "Just enough for you to shower. Maybe eat something that didn't come from a vending machine." She wanted to argue, but the heaviness in her limbs answered for her. The apartment Mason had arranged was simple and quiet. 2 small bedrooms, a kitchenette, and a view of the city. Grace showered while Mason made scrambled eggs and toast. When she came out, hair damp and face pale, the plate was waiting on the table. "You didn't have to," she started. "I know," he said. "Eat anyway." That first day passed slowly. They returned to the hospital after breakfast and spent the day by Nancy's bedside. Mason brought a small stuffed bear from the gift shop. Grace read picture books in a soft voice, trying to keep the tremble from it. Whenever Nancy stirred, Mason was there. He played peekaboo, made paper animals from tissues, and told silly stories that made her giggle through the oxygen mask. On the second day, Grace stepped out to get some air. When she returned, she found Mason helping Nancy color a page in a hospital activity book. He held the crayon carefully in her tiny hand, letting her scribble hearts and stars. "Beautiful," he said, grinning. "I think we've got a future artist here." Grace leaned in the doorway watching them. Something warm bloomed in her chest, strange and unfamiliar. That evening, Mason insisted she go back to the apartment and sleep for a few hours. "I'll stay with her," he said. "I promise." Grace hesitated. "She's safe with me, Grace." She believed him. The apartment felt emptier without the quiet beep of monitors and Nancy's presence. But, for the first time in weeks, Grace laid her head on a pillow and drifted into deep, dreamless sleep. The next night, the night before the surgery, she returned late, expecting to find Mason gone. Instead, she stepped into Nancy's room and stopped short. The lights were dimmed. The machines glowed softly in the dark, and there, slumped in the recliner beside Nancy's bed, was Mason. His head rested against the back of the chair, mouth slightly parted. One arm lay across the bed rail, his hand curled gently around Nancy's. He had not moved. Grace stood there for a long moment, her throat tight. She walked quietly to the side of the bed, knelt down beside him, and looked at the way their hands fit together, so naturally, like they had always belonged that way. Nancy stirred slightly but did not wake. Mason didn't either. Grace whispered into the stillness, voice catching on the words she had never dared to speak aloud. "Maybe you're the miracle I didn't pray for, but God sent anyway." She brushed a strand of hair from Nancy's forehead, then one from Mason's, and for the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't carrying the weight of the world alone. The surgery lasted 6 hours. Grace paced the hospital hallway the entire time, her arms crossed tightly, her nails bitten to the quick. Mason sat nearby, silent, alert, ready to hold her up if her knees gave out. When the surgeon finally emerged, mask pulled down, eyes tired but smiling, Grace could hardly breathe. "She made it," Dr. Keller said. "The operation was a success." Grace cried, not loudly, not dramatically, but the kind of tears that come from relief so deep it knocks the breath out of you. Mason didn't say anything. He just placed a hand on her shoulder and stood beside her until she found the strength to walk into the recovery room. Nancy was pale and fragile, a tangle of wires and monitors, but alive, breathing, healing. Over the next 2 days, Grace never left her daughter's side. Mason visited quietly, bringing food, checking in with nurses, arranging small comforts, a warmer blanket, a lavender-scented pillow, a new coloring book Nancy could use when she was strong enough. Then, on the third morning, Mason wasn't there. Grace found a small note tucked into the pocket of her coat. "You two need space to be together now. No obligations, no expectations, just healing." She read it twice. She should have felt grateful, but all she felt was empty. Nancy noticed, too. "Where's Mr. Mason?" she asked that afternoon, tugging weakly at her juice straw. "He went home for a while," Grace said softly. "Why?" Grace had no answer. "He was nice," Nancy mumbled. "I miss him." Grace did too, more than she expected. His absence left a silence she hadn't realized he'd filled. A week passed. Nancy grew stronger each day. They moved from ICU to a regular room, then were discharged with a long list of follow-ups. Life, in its own quiet way, started again. One afternoon, not long after they returned to town, Grace took Nancy to the park near their apartment. The sun was low, casting golden light through the trees. Nancy ran, really ran for the first time in months. Grace laughed and clapped as her daughter twirled in circles, arms outstretched. It was the sound of footsteps that made her turn. Mason stood a few feet away, dressed simply, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. Nothing fancy, just stems wrapped in brown paper. He looked nervous. "I heard she was doing well," he said, nodding toward Nancy. Grace's breath caught. "She's better than well." He smiled, then hesitated. "I didn't want to push. I just missed you both." Grace stepped forward, heart thudding. "We missed you too." He looked down at the flowers, then back up at her. "I was thinking," he said, voice lower now, "maybe I could buy you that cup of coffee again. Every morning." Grace stared at him, the corners of her mouth lifting. Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't blink them away. She closed the distance between them, reached for the flowers with one hand, and wrapped her other arm around his waist. She rested her head lightly on his chest. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rushed. It was honest, soft, sure. Mason held her gently, pressing his cheek to her hair as the late sun bathed them in gold. Nancy ran toward them a moment later, arms open wide. "Mason!" she shouted joyfully. He bent down, scooping her up into his arms, holding both girls close. And in that quiet corner of the world, surrounded by laughter, light, and the scent of wildflowers, Grace allowed herself to lean in for the first time, unafraid. 1 year later, the air in the small town outside Minneapolis smelled of pine and sunshine. The trees were full, the skies open, and the future finally felt wide and full of color. Grace stood in the corner office of a modest building tucked beside a children's hospital. On her desk sat a framed photo of Nancy holding a teddy bear, and beside it a nameplate that read, "Grace Whitmore, Family Coordinator, Hope Hearts Foundation." She had traded in coffee-stained aprons and motel cleaning carts for this. Not power, not wealth, but purpose. The nonprofit Mason had founded just months after Nancy's recovery had quickly become a lifeline for families in crisis. Now, Grace was the one calling hospitals, helping desperate parents navigate insurance, securing treatment, arranging rides, booking temporary housing. Every time she helped another child get to surgery on time, she thought of Nancy and Mason. That afternoon, as her shift ended, she walked outside and found a familiar black SUV parked at the curb. Inside, Nancy was bouncing in the back seat, her cheeks rosy, eyes bright with life. She waved excitedly through the window. Grace climbed in beside her, and Mason reached over to squeeze her hand. "Everything good at the office?" he asked. Grace leaned into him. "All good. We just approved funding for a girl in Kansas City. She flies out next week." Mason smiled. "You're amazing, you know that?" "I had a good teacher," she said softly. They drove toward the lake where they had planned a quiet picnic, just the three of them. Nancy ran ahead as soon as they arrived, racing down the grassy hill toward the water, laughter trailing behind her like music. She wore overalls and a butterfly clip in her hair. A year ago, she could barely walk across the room without losing her breath. Now, she was unstoppable. Grace spread out the blanket while Mason unpacked the basket. Sandwiches, fruit, juice boxes, and one special item he pulled out last with a small smile. A stainless steel thermos. Smooth and silver, well used but polished. Grace raised an eyebrow. He handed it to her. "Open it." She unscrewed the cap, expecting coffee. Instead, she saw the inside was empty, but etched on the inside of the lid were words that made her throat catch. It started with a coffee, but became a family. She looked up at him, her eyes full. He shrugged, that same quiet smile on his face. "I figured it was time we had a family motto." Grace didn't speak. She leaned forward, pressing her lips softly against his. Nancy's voice rang out a moment later. "Ew!" she shouted playfully, hands on her hips. "Mom, Dad!" They both laughed. Grace pulled Mason closer, her heart full in a way she never imagined it could be. They sat down together, all three of them, as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Nancy picked wildflowers and handed one to each of them. The lake glimmered. The air was still. And for the first time in a long, long while, everything felt exactly right. Because it had started with a coffee. But what they built was a life, a home, a family. Thank you for reading this heartwarming story. If it touched your soul even just a little, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button to support our channel, where kindness, love, and hope come to life through every tale we tell. Because sometimes all it takes is one small act of kindness to change everything. See you in the next story.